WePredict provides predictive analytics mainly to car manufacturers, but manufacturers actually of all types of products, to help them understand from initial data how well their products are going to perform in the field at 12 months of ownership all the way out to the end of life of the vehicle or the product.
So Deep View TrueCost, it's a first time that we've been able to bring together millions and millions of service records and repair orders throughout the United States to really look for the first time what the true cost is, what's the actual spending on parts and components and labors as customers bring their vehicles in for service at a dealership or at a service facility across the U.S.
For more than a decade, WePredict has been working with manufacturers, captive finance companies, suppliers, fleet companies, and others to provide a unique view of their own field data. Combining our exclusive and validated forecasting methodology with warranty and customer pay service records across the industry allows a first-time view of competitive, predictive component performance. These insights save our clients millions of dollars on warranty, cut costly repairs, and galvanize their customer reputation. Our predictive insights reveal how each component and each vehicle will perform today, in 30 days, in 1 year, in 5 years, allowing our clients to become smarter businesses on many fronts, such as improved quality, increased dealership and after-sales opportunities, aligned appropriate accruals and cash flow, stabilized balance sheets with our insurance coverage, personalized with telematic data, and prioritize the service claims that most impact customer satisfaction. Accelerate towards certainty.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for attending today's session, U.S. Propulsion Policy. My name is Brett Smith. I'm Director of Technology at the Center for Automotive Research. Before we start, I have a couple of announcements or comments I want to make. The first one is, by the way, possibly the most pertinent announcement I've ever made at a car management briefing seminar for a session. And they ask, if you have an EV and it is parked in the EV charging spot, please move it as soon as it is charged. People are waiting. Which seems like a really good way to start out this discussion, doesn't it? The other is, we had the golf outing yesterday, and we had a great time. And I want to thank QAD, our sponsor. If any of you were in the golf outing, you appreciate QAD's support on this. If any of you may have won, their Mary is still out right outside that door waiting with your prize. So if there was a winner out there, I know I was clearly not a winner in that outing. We hope that you'll go and grab your prize. But again, thanks to QAD for supporting that. That's been something we've done for a lot of years, and it is a lot of fun. Again, my name is Brett Smith, Director of Technology at the Center for Automotive Research. We have 4 wonderful speakers. Mr. Bill Charmley, Director of Assessment and Standards Division for the Office of Transportation and Air Quality, is on the line. He'll be joining us every now and then, but we can see Bill. And Bill, it's good to see you. Bill looks like he's in a beautiful place with mountains and all kinds of things, but I suspect it's probably closer to Southeast Michigan. We also have Julia Rege, who is the Vice President, Energy and the Environment for the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. Brian Doherty, Chief Technology Officer for the MEMA, the Motor Equipment Manufacturers Association. And Chris Nevers, who Chris has been in many roles, but now comes to us as the Senior Director of Policy at Rivian. So thank you all for coming. Our plan today is some brief introductory comments, and then we'll jump into discussion. I have certainly some questions. I have quite a few, but absolutely open it up to your questions. As we started to plan for this back in March, I was very excited because the EPA announced, or the Biden administration announced, that they would have policy set by the end of July. And I thought, that's a great opportunity for us to get together in Traverse City and talk policy. It'll be exciting, it'll be brand new, it'll be perfect timing. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, right? We're almost there. We're really close. Someone said noon tomorrow. So if we delayed this 24 hours, it might be a different discussion. but there's still a ton to talk about today. And with that, let's start with Bill. Bill, if you could open in comments, and then we'll move on through the panel. Again, welcome to Traverse City, Bill.
Thank you very much, Brett. I really appreciate it. And yes, I am in my home in Metro Detroit. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to travel up today. So as Brett mentioned, my name is Bill Charmley, and I work in Ann Arbor, Michigan at the National Vehicle and Fuel Emissions Laboratory. And the group that I lead is in the Office of Transportation and Air Quality, which is in the Air Office of EPA. And our primary responsibility in our office is to address air pollution issues from all transportation sources and transportation fuels. And the specific role of the group that I lead is the regulatory development group for EPA for transportation, including for light-duty vehicles. So we're responsible for the rulemakings and standard setting processes for light-duty vehicles, both for criteria pollutants and as well as for greenhouse gas emissions. And I really wanted to thank the Center for Automotive Research inviting us to speak today. As Brett mentioned, I think that we are very, very close to being responsive, at least to the initial request direction from the new administration, from President Biden. On his first day in office, one of the executive orders the president signed was regarding the climate crisis. And that executive order covered a number of topics, but certainly one of them was directing the administrator of EPA to reconsider the light-duty vehicle greenhouse gas emission standards that were put in place by the previous administration. So, as far as my overall opening remarks, I'm going to say that it's been at EPA since the early 90s, and certainly for all of us who live in the Metro Detroit area, we've seen the impact of a lot of wide range of policies from the federal government over the years. But with all that being said, EPA's mission, and the group that I work in, our mission has never really strayed. Our mission is to reconcile the emissions from vehicles in the transportation sector with the environment and for public health. So the new administration has clearly established some very aggressive big picture policy goals that include addressing the climate crisis, and addressing clean air for all, addressing the impacts of environmental justice. And all of those have a strong intersection with the transportation sector, and interactions and across a strong intersection with light-duty vehicles in particular. And so we're very excited, the career team at EPA, about working with the new administration to help them try to accomplish some of their policy goals on transportation and on light-duty vehicles. So in addition to our near-term actions to help the administration consider how they might want to revise the existing standards, we're also looking forward to working with the administration, providing them the technical support that they will need in order to look beyond the near term and look to the long term. And I think I'm very excited about that, because there's just a really strong opportunity, given where the overall global industry and the U.S. industry is headed in the long term, for more and more commitments from companies to work towards zero emission vehicles. And of course, that would be wonderful, and wonderful to have EPA policy help support and direct and guide those, because that is largely what our mission is as well, to work towards ultra clean zero emission technologies. So with that, Brett, I am going to turn it back to you.
Bill, thank you for starting us. And again, remind you, the bios for each of our speakers are in your app. Please take a look at those. We have a pretty short schedule today, so a lot of things to cover. Instead of talking about the bios, we'll keep talking about the content. So we start with government. The next part to this discussion is the manufacturers. And Julia, how about yourself?
All right. Hi, I'm Julia Rege. I'm Vice President for Energy and Environment at the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. And as I was thinking about sitting up here today, it occurred to me the last time there was a car MBS, there was no auto innovators. And so it might help to just take a quick minute to talk about who we are. So we formed in 2020 following the merger of the previous two auto trade associations, the Auto Alliance, and global automakers. Today, we represent nearly 40 companies throughout the automotive value chain. So we have automakers that produce and sell about 99% of the new vehicles in the US, tier one suppliers, as well as technology and mobility companies. And by bringing all of these companies together, we provide a unified voice for the auto industry. And I think that's really important when we think about the context of today's discussion. And so there's 3 points I'll quickly cover here. The first is that the auto industry is committed to reaching the goals of net zero carbon transportation. Certainly, we have made great progress in improving fuel economy, 30% over the past 15 years, in addressing air quality as well with near zero tailpipe emissions and reductions in criteria pollutants, about 99% since the 1970s. That's really great progress. And that progress and innovation that has produced those benefits is going to be absolutely critical to moving us forward in obtaining the goals for net zero carbon transportation as well. And that leads me to my second point, and that is, as the pressures to address climate change and to really continue the progress we've done to date continue, what we will see is a reliance on more electrification going forward. And so, yes, your announcement about charging vehicles was really relevant today, Brett. And that's exactly the kind of thing that we are thinking about as we go to increase electrification, how we build out a full vision for this technology. But I do think it's important to note that the auto industry is committed to spending over $300 billion through 2025. That is a really significant investment in electric technologies going forward. And we expect to see a tripling of the number of models on the road by 2025 as well, something like 130 miles. And that's really incredible. And that leads me to my last point, which is we want to see this technology be successful, and we need to make sure that we are all working together. And when I say we, I don't actually just mean the auto industry anymore. This has become a team sport where we need every player on the field working together in a coordinated and comprehensive fashion to make sure that we are working on the manufacturing and supply chain aspects of electric vehicles, making sure the infrastructure development is continuing and keeping pace with the technology, and ultimately making sure that the customer is coming along as well. And so it's really vital that we're working on things like affordability, equity, and convenience, all pieces that are going to bring more customers to the table to buy electric vehicles.
Julia, your comment real quick on the stakeholders. I look at your list, and we can see it in front. Your list of partners is inclusive. It's suppliers, it's vehicle manufacturers. 2 years ago, you had a couple suppliers in the there were two different groups.
Yes, global automakers had suppliers previously.
Thank you. It's already been 2 years. The globals and the others. Now you've got them all together, and you're herding cats sometimes, but bringing them in. And I've noticed as we've gone through this process, it seems more inclusive. It's not inclusive, but it's more inclusive.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we need everybody at the table working together because yes, the automakers have a large role to play in producing the technology and bringing it to market. But quite frankly, we rely on our suppliers. They have a vision and a role to play. And it's more than just the supplier community that we need at the table as well. We need utilities, government, state and federal. Really just everyone has a role to play going forward.
So Brian, perfect lead in for you. It's a team effort. Maybe at this point. Talk about your perspective from MEMA.
Thank you, Brett. So my name is Brian Darby. I'm the Chief Technology Officer of the Motor and Equipment Manufacturers Association, also known as MEMA. Also here representing one of our largest divisions, OESA, the Original Equipment Suppliers Association. MEMA basically has 4 divisions that represent the suppliers to vehicle OEMs in North America. So the light vehicle is OESA. We have a heavy duty division. We have an aftermarket division and also a remanufacturing division. So from that perch, it's very interesting as the vehicle technology CTO to see the different technology trends across all of those different areas and working with our 1,000-member companies. So, to your question, yes, it's absolutely, a team effort. Our members within OESA and MEMA are all working to supply the products that are needed by the OEs to meet these standards for emissions and for CO2 reduction. And we've got a lot of interesting trends going on in addition to just fuel economy. We've got, huge advances in automation, vehicle automation, ADAS systems, cybersecurity, connectivity, and all of these issues are being dealt with in trends by our supplier members all the time, trying to, as well as the OEMs, trying to get all of this in new vehicles as we're developing them over the next few years. So there's an awful lot going on. And to some of Julia's points earlier, I actually have an article in the OESA news letter that's on your table there if you're interested, a little bit provocative, talking about how many different models we're going to see over the next few years. And you mentioned 130. I've seen some estimates up as high as 140 BEV models offered in the US by 2025. And the risk, I think, just to kind of kick things off from an issue standpoint, is that if you're 10% of sales in 2025 are BEVs and you have 140 models, the math starts to get pretty tough for people to make money on that. And I think that's one of the things our industry is really going to have to face is how do we transition to this new technology paradigm and yet still make money on all these vehicles.
Very good. And so the newest member of this stakeholder group is those startup electric vehicle companies. And Chris Nevers, who if you look at his bio, Chris has been everywhere, done it all kind of guy. Is now representing kind of the new stakeholder, in this case, Rivian. Chris, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Brett, and thanks for having us here. So my name is Chris Nevers. I'm Rivian's Senior Director of Public Policy. And for those of you that aren't aware, I'm sure most of you are with Rivian. Rivian is an independent, US-based, all-electric vehicle manufacturer with facilities in California, Michigan, and production in Normal, Illinois. Excuse me. Now, Rivian, you may have heard our mission. Our mission is to keep the world adventurous forever. And you might say, what does that mean at a panel like this? Well, keeping the world adventurous forever, the forever part means sustainability. And sustainability really means electrification. In this case, light duty electrification. Can you go to the first slide, please? So as we're waiting for the slide, what I had planned to show were our three products. We have a R1T, R1S, and last mile delivery vehicle. Now, the R1T with features like 300-mile driving range and 11,000 pounds towing capacity will see its first deliveries this September. And then sometime after that, you will see the R1S and the last mile delivery vehicle. The R1S is a full-size SUV with 5 and 7 passenger seating. And the last mile delivery vehicle is an Amazon vehicle. We have an agreement with Amazon to deliver 100,000 of those vehicles by 2030. Now those vehicles, the last mile delivery vehicles, are Class 2B and 3, so they're not necessarily covered by the regulation we're going to be talking about today, but the R1S and the R1T are covered by that regulation. But even though they're covered by the regulation, they weren't necessarily considered when the regulations were written. And I think that's important. Rivian wasn't around when the regulations were first written under Obama, and they were really just starting up when SAFE was written. And once again, with this proposal, we'll see how much Rivian was in the mix there. But it's not just Rivian; it's other startup manufacturers. Yeah. It's this jump to electrification that we're seeing. Really, this S-curve penetration electrification we're seeing. So, one thing that I think we're keen on is seeing how the EPA and others address that expansion into electrification.
Yeah. And Chris, sorry we didn't get those pictures up. They're beautiful trucks. Even the Amazon delivery truck is good looking, which is a credit to Rivian to make a delivery truck look good. So we have, we bring the group back together. We'll start out with a question. As I said earlier, we were hoping, planning, praying for an announcement, but that didn't happen. But maybe a starting question. Oh, there they are. No, they're not there. There they are.
We can just leave them up the whole time.
Just leave them up the whole time. Beautiful. And we might stick Bill in there once in a while. But so I want to start this out. We've been anxiously waiting for a while for this policy. It is really important, we think. But with all of the industry's announced commitment, 130, 140 battery electric vehicles, 300 billion, Julia, did you say? 300 billion is a little bit of money. All of that commitment to making battery electric vehicles. Bill, I'll start with you. Does a fuel economy policy is it really necessary?
So a couple of thoughts on that. First of all, I think Chris already knows this, but we have other regulations that we can include Rivian's other vehicle on, so we'd be more than interested in talking with them on that, on the Amazon vehicle. But on your question, the whole, the history of EPA's vehicle standards has been setting out performance-based emission requirements to ensure that the industry is making progress towards meeting clean air and environmental goals. And it's very, very exciting to hear, as I mentioned before, all of the announcements that have been made over the last 1 or 2 years, and really, especially in just the last 6 months, of an acceleration where some of the major global players, US companies as well, made announcements 2 or 3 years ago about their commitment to zero emission technology, and then even more recently said that they're going to accelerate those plans, these huge plans to transform the companies in the industry. And so the role of the EPA's emission standards are to ensure that clean air happens. So I would say the answer is without question, yes. It's not the type of thing that you want to leave it to chance. We want the industry to be successful on this transition. We want to make sure that EPA's policies help provide long-term goals and stability, if possible, as far as regulatory goals for the industry. So my own view would be, yes, we want to standards also provide an assurance where for a level playing field, make sure that all the companies have to work towards the same goals, and hopefully, in some cases, the point of regulatory requirements is to help accelerate the transition. So from my perspective, I absolutely think that it continues to be necessary to have future greenhouse gas standards and targets for the industry.
Julia, from the automaker's point, what is the use of the fuel economy standards if you're switching so quickly to BEVs?
Well, I think I'm going to defer to Bill. If Bill and his team are continuing to work on standards, we'll continue to work with Bill and his team on what those standards are. And so I'm actually going to look at this from a slightly different direction. And as we are seeing these commitments being made about electric vehicles, do we have the right policies in place to make sure that these vehicles are going to be successful? And I'm thinking of a letter, a joint auto industry letter that we put out in March of this year, where we really looked at those necessary conditions for success and broke it into 3 pillars where we think it's really critical to have federal and state action so that we're all working together to build out more consumer interest and adoption for electric vehicles. So that's things like manufacturing and supply chain incentives, making sure that we have the right funding to continue building and growing a robust network of charging stations, as well as hydrogen fueling stations. And then third, incentives. Do we have the right incentives for customers to move to electric vehicles? The kind of change that we're talking about here is transformative, and it's not going to just happen overnight that customers see the new shiny electric vehicle and buy it. We need to make sure the policies are in place and the market is really coming along with all the vehicles as they are released into the marketplace as well.
Brian, from the perspective of the suppliers, what does a CAFE rule mean to them in terms of going forward, thinking about the future?
Well, I think in general, anytime you have a forcing function, forcing anything in a direction, so higher MPG, lower CO2 emissions, that generates the need for new and innovative technology. So the supply base, invests a lot of money to develop these new technologies and provide them to the OEM so that they can meet these standards. So I think really the benefit for suppliers in this is that we're seeing massive technology change very quickly. And in general, the support for suppliers in terms of, investment tax credits and things of that nature to support that transition are very important. So we're here and ready to support the OEMs in their quest to deliver whatever technology they'd like to. So.
And Chris, for those on the EV startup side, what is a consistent or more stringent or less stringent CAFE mean to you?
Well, first I'd like to say Rivian was going to build EVs before this rule, and they're going to build EVs after this rule. We're going to build EVs no matter what. But I will say what this rule does is it could set a higher baseline, and you could convince other manufacturers, maybe not necessarily startups who are going to do EVs anyway, but other manufacturers to maybe join the California framework, for example. I don't know if we're going to get into that or not, but it really lays out other options for manufacturers maybe they weren't concerned about or looking at before.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Bill, I'm going to we probably should have done a level set at the beginning. You and I had talked about doing that when we had expected the bill or the policies to be out. We didn't follow up. Help us out. What are we talking about in terms of the current, the future, and beyond, and how EPA is looking at this or how the administration is measuring this? We have a set of standards through 2025 that you're considering. We have 2025 and beyond, and then beyond that. Could you give a little bit of perspective on that or background on what the level playing field is or what that future is?
Sure, Brett, thank you. And back in the previous two administrations ago, under President Obama's administration, EPA did two regulatory actions for light-duty vehicles for greenhouse gas emissions, and combined, they set greenhouse gas standards from 2012 model year all the way through 2025 model year. But we had agreed that because we were going so far out in time, that we would take a closer look at the tail end of those standards, and we committed to a process to do that. And so under President Trump's administration, EPA went through a public process that looked at the tail end of those standards, specifically where we are now, 21. We looked at 21 through 2026, and President Trump's administration, we significantly revised the standards we had established back in 2012 and reduced the stringency from a 5% per year-over-year improvement to 1.5%. So those are the current EPA requirements for 21 through 2026. Under President Trump, we extended the program by one more year. So 1.5% improvements per year through 2026. And when I mentioned that on the first day of President Biden's new administration, President Biden put out an executive order that specifically directed EPA to look at that program that President Trump's administration put in place that EPA revised, and to specifically consider one more time revising those tail end standards, the 21 through 2026 standards. So there's sort of two things that the current administration is doing. One is, I think that from their perspective, they're looking at how to get the standards back on track from their perspective of what might be appropriate through 2026. So that's certainly one action that we are actively working on, and I think this proposal will be announced very soon on that. In addition, the President Biden's administration has had very, very big picture goals for the United States as a whole for climate change, going out to 2030 and beyond. And so I think that almost certainly EPA will be working on not only a near-term action to consider from this administration's perspective sort of getting the standards back on track, but also looking at an opportunity to set emission standards that will go out beyond our current standards. Our current standards go through 2026.
Thank you. And so I'd like to follow up. There's a question from the audience. I'll try to rephrase it a little bit. But having worked with the Alliance and Autos Innovate and Globals and MEMA over the years, you are a group of companies. You are not one entity. Julia, as we look at the car companies, some of them have different strategies for electrification. Some are all in on battery electrics, others are on plug-ins, others are on hybrids. How do you as an organization herd those cats and communicate those messages clearly? It's so easy to do, right? They all jump in line?
Well, I think what's important here is that there really aren't cats to herd when we're all looking at how to create an electric vehicle future. And in fact, you need all three technologies. You need the plug-in hybrids, the battery electric, and the hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles so that we are providing the most options for our customers and helping to move customers to vehicles that will meet their needs and also provide the benefits of electrification as well. And so I'd actually have to say that we're very well aligned as an organization that all of those technologies are something that are on the table and will be needed. Again, we do need to also look at the other policy factors in the US to make sure that we are building out the manufacturing and supply chain capacity to actually make those vehicles here in the US, and so that we can continue to build upon the success we've seen to date. And you know, in certain states, like California, we have almost 8 reaching 10% of sales that are electric vehicles. The other 49 states, we need to do some work to catch up because overall the US is only at 2%, but we're going to need all of those options on the table going forward.
Beautiful. And that, Brian, sets up for the technology development from the suppliers. You've got even more cats with even more diverse experiences and visions. How do you help articulate what they need to policy, but also communicate back to them their future?
So that's a really good question. I would agree with Julie, though. I'd say, you know, our members really understand and are looking to understand the technology trends. And there's going to be a lot of different approaches by different suppliers on how they, you know, deliver product, you know, that's needed for vehicles of the future. So there are going to be many different strategies, and that's a good thing because some of them will work and some of them won't work. So I think it's good to have that diversity of thought and diversity in the supply base. You know, one of my roles is to really, in addition to working with Ann Wilson's team in Washington, D.C., and the presidents of our divisions like Julie Freem and OESA, is to understand what regulations are coming down and how they're going to impact members and really give our members a sense of, you know, how this could affect, you know, their business decisions from a technology roadmap standpoint in their business. But it's also to understand the members and what they need in terms of help from Washington, D.C. and from regulations to, you know, successfully supply the OEMs the products that they need when they need them. And then another role is really looking at the technology trends that are coming, and there's a lot of different technologies that are, you know, coming to pass in vehicles in the next few years, and help them understand how that's really going to impact their business, because there are a lot of decisions that are going to need to be made, and it's a very complex business environment as we start talking about transitioning, big transitions.
So Chris, I saw you back there thinking about your days at the Alliance and herding those cats. You, as I said, you've worked for auto companies. You've worked, I think, with Bill at EPA. You've worked with Julia in the Alliances. And now you're working for an electric vehicle company. Give us some perspective on the differences in viewpoints and maybe what you've taken or what you've learned in your last year or so as you've become a cool, hip EV startup guy with plaid coat.
Yeah, well, I don't know about the cool part, but I'll try. You learn something all along your career, obviously, and EPA, they really have probably access to the most data and vision, and they have to satisfy a lot of concerns, you know. And I'm not speaking for Bill, but it's not just the industry, it's the EJ community, it's the political side, it's everything. And then when you get to the trade association side, you do have many members, and you do maybe not have to always herd cats. Maybe it got better since I left, but you do have to herd a lot of industry cats and all their concerns. They might be divergent concerns. Okay. But then when you get to a manufacturer, in this case, an EV manufacturer, you really get to see behind the curtain and what's possible. Now, I might know what's possible, for example, for Rivian, but I wouldn't know what's possible for other OEMs. And so that's one reason why you get involved in this process, the rulemaking process. So I wouldn't necessarily say that my opinions have changed. It's just the information I've had access to has changed.
Very good. Thank you. Very, very thoughtful, very careful. I like that. There are a lot of questions here, and I'm trying to page through. One is from someone remote, I believe, who talks about the future of the internal combustion engine. Even if we get a lot of battery electric vehicles on the road in the next 5 to 10 years, there's still going to be a lot of ICE vehicles built. Brian, let's come back to you for a moment with your supply base. How do you balance this potential, the excitement over a battery electric vehicle, and you talked about that may or may not get volume soon, and you may be on a platform that doesn't sell a lot, versus the fact that you've still got to make that battery electric, or the internal combustion engine more efficient and better all the time? Because if you don't, you're wasting 20 good years of research or of development.
No, that's a really good point. When you're talking about a wholesale transition of technology, obviously there's a lot of change happening rapidly. I think the entire supply base is grappling with exactly those decisions, and you're going to see some that continue concentrating on ICE components, even though the volumes of those will may go down over future years, and obviously probably will. You're seeing other suppliers getting into many different areas and kind of diversifying their product lines. So I think there's going to be a lot of different methods for this. But you mentioned one of the difficulties, and that is some of the volumes of these programs are going to be quite low when you do the math. And that's kind of what my article talks about. And that's really going to be a struggle for a lot of companies, OEMs and suppliers. When we had hybrids back, 20 years ago, those of us who've been in the vehicle industry for a long time remember, hybrids were going to take over everything, and they got up to 4 or 5% of sales and really not much higher. The advantage that a hybrid had, though, from a supplier or an OE standpoint, is if a consumer bought a hybrid or an ICE or a V6 or a V8, it didn't matter. If you supplied the door handles and the headliner and the seats, you sold them in whatever version was going out the door of the plant. Now we're talking about dedicated BEV platforms where you've invested $500 million to $1 billion in a platform, and now everything on that platform is fairly custom to that platform. And that's not always true, but there's a lot of vehicles that are coming out that are kind of dedicated BEV vehicles now that you can't change the powertrain. You can't put an ICE in that vehicle if that's what the consumer in the end wants. So it's going to be an interesting couple of years as we go through this transition, because if those volumes are very low and you've capacitized for a much higher volume, how do you rationalize that and still make money as a supplier?
Yeah, we Edgar Fehler in the back, my associate, we've been talking about this glide path for a couple of years, and it's a tough challenge for the manufacturers and the suppliers to figure out that glide path. Bill, I wanted to come back to you, if we could bring you back from the mountains there for a moment. We've heard a lot over the last week about a proposed promise, guideline, estimate of 40% EVs. I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about the process. Does the administration or the EPA have tools in its box to regulate a technology and as a percentage, or are there ways for, if someone said we want 40% EVs by 2040, or 100%, or 10%, is that possible under EPA policy?
So thanks, Brett. So, the history of our standards for light duty vehicles for both criteria pollutants, so NOx and PM type emissions and hydrocarbons, and also for greenhouse gases is our standards have almost always been performance-based standards. So in the case of CO2 emissions, we have emission standards that decline each year and set obligation for our company. And they've been in gram per mile, grams of CO2 per mile space for each company's fleet. And so, certainly we have the authority to do that. We have also, though, your specific question was if a given administration, this administration, or in the future, said, well, we want to modify that in a way to, require a certain level of a given technology. I would say that depending on how it was structured, something like that probably could be possible. We've had, I'll use as an example, our light duty vehicle, our tier 2 and tier 3 criteria pollutant emission standards. So these are for NOx and VOC emissions. We have bins, 5 or 6 bins, levels of NOx performance. And the lowest bin is 0. And so certainly I think that if an administration wanted that to be a policy, you could design a policy or design a regulation that could require certain increasing quantities of specifically of zero emission vehicle technology. But at the same time, you could achieve those type of policy goals through what we already have in place today, which is a CO2 standard. And as that CO2 standard becomes lower and lower, the number of options that you have to comply over time, it will require, if the stringency is significant enough, more and more ultra low zero emission vehicle technology. So I would say theoretically it could be possible, certainly, but it would a lot of it depend on what is the goal of the administration itself. And as you mentioned, I'm not prepared to announce anything today because I'm a career team member for the EPA, not for the Biden administration, and they'll decide how they want to articulate those goals.
And we absolutely understand that. We don't want today to be your last day with EPA. We appreciate that. So I want to come back to Julia on this for a moment, but before I do, theoretically, could EPA or the Biden administration or an administration adopt the California ZEV mandate where you require a certain amount of ZEVs? Is it feasible, whether it's realistic or not? I've had several questions over the last couple of weeks about this. Bill, I'm sorry. Bill.
I apologize. I thought you were asking Julia.
Yeah, I said I wanted to come back to Julia in a minute. I'm sorry. Bad moderating. It's been a couple of years. So is it, I've had people ask, is it feasible for something like ZEV to be implemented on a national level? We're seeing it on the 177 states, but is it something that EPA, an administration, or others could implement technology force?
Yeah, I guess that's what I was trying to answer before.
Yeah.
I think that theoretically that type of program structure could be considered.
Could be.
Yes. Whether or not that specific policy would be something that administration would want to. I was trying to be a little bit more generic and saying the goal was to be a certain level of zero emission vehicle technologies. Yeah, there's probably more than one way that you could do that, including something that would result in certain sales percentages.
Super. So Julia, I want to come back, as I said, this time, Bill, I promise I'm not coming back to you. Julia, on this case, from that technology point, what is the Alliance's perspective on this idea versus lowering to a standard that can only be achieved by a battery electric vehicle versus requiring a certain amount, the technology forced versus the emissions forced? Is there any?
Yeah, I think to Bill's point, there's different ways of achieving that and putting forth that goal, and whatever method is used is something that we would be looking at very carefully to make sure that it builds in the appropriate elements that help to encourage electric vehicles and make sure that we have enough flexibility for the goals. But that second piece of the additional policies is going to become more and more important no matter which method we use going forward. Because the fact of the matter is we're talking about radically transforming the type of vehicles that people buy today. And we need to make sure that we're working to put those necessary conditions for success in place that are going to bring the customers along. And so it's no longer about the policy or how you implement the policy. It's about that broader viewpoint of the policy, the commitment, the long-term goal, and everything that comes along with it to make sure that we are all working in coordination towards that goal.
Chris, does it matter to you all? Does it matter to Rivian if there's a requirement or
No, not really. We're gonna build EVs regardless. And when Julie mentions radically different, I mean they're still vehicles, and I wouldn't say they're radically better. If you've ever driven one or been in one, and they're definitely better for the environment. And when it comes to supportive policies, I think in the last, I think John Bozzella put on a panel just a little while ago, and they were talking about the Senate infrastructure bill. That's going to help. For example, the expanding the ATVM to medium and heavy duty, expanding infrastructure for clean corridors. But there are things to be done at the state level too. And I would be remiss if I didn't add at the state level. You do this in Michigan, and it would cost the state nothing, at least from their from the funding anyway. One would be adopt a low carbon fuel standard, which could help support electrification. And secondly, you could allow direct sales for electric vehicles. So that's my plug on direct sales.
We knew you had to go there. We appreciate it. Dermot O'Connell from Tesla came on this very stage about in that very spot and said the same thing 6 years ago, and we're still struggling with that challenge.
Well, I will note that most EVs in the U.S. are sold via direct sales.
Yeah, it's a different business model. Brian?
I was just going to add, we've talked and Bill mentioned too, generally we advocate for a technology agnostic, regulatory policy, right? So let the supply base, the OEMs and the suppliers figure out the best way to meet a standard that the government and the citizens of a country want to institute. I think when you start saying you have to have this specific amount of this specific technology, you're trying in advance to pick a winner. What if there's a new ICE technology that comes out 2 years from now, and there are quite a few of them out there that could overall be more efficient than a battery electric vehicle that's getting, its energy essentially from a coal-fired power plant. So I think we're going to need to, as a country, take a more holistic look at the entire ecosystem, life cycle analysis for the production of the vehicles, looking at the power grid in a realistic way, and not just hoping that it's all solar and wind someday, and that's going to make sense, because we could actually do more damage to the climate in the near term by not having as many hybrids and other technologies on the road, and just focusing on BEVs.
Yeah, I'm ready, Chris. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to respond to that. So in the Senate package, there are proposals to do just that, to look at life cycle analysis. And trust me, a lot of people look at life cycle. A lot of the NGOs look at life cycle. I will note that even in Michigan, which was coal heavy, I want to say Consumers Power has announced by 2030, they were retiring their last coal plant and going strictly natural gas. In just that one step alone, you're cutting 67% of your CO2 emissions for electricity. So I think one thing I would add is what's great about electric vehicles, they're sort of omnivores. It doesn't really matter where you get the electricity, it's electricity. And so then it's a matter of cleaning the electric grid further. It's already very clean. And when you look nationwide already at the tailpipe level, EVs are cleaner everywhere in the US by region. It's only getting better.
So Bill, I want to come back to you on this. There's a question, and I got it called out because the gentleman, Christopher Thomas, refers to Uwe Grebe, which was not last year, although I don't think last year counts because no one did anything last year. It was 2 years ago at this forum. Uwe Grebe from AVL talked about the coal and electricity from coal, and how, as Brian discusses, maybe it's more efficient or more clean in the near term to be doing it otherwise. What is EPA's charge with regard to upstream life cycle analysis now and going forward for electric vehicles? Bill?
Thanks, Brett. No, I'll just take myself off mute. So I guess a couple of thoughts on that. One is, it's so obvious what Chris said, that across the whole country, right, natural gas is killing coal, as far, not killing on the price side. I meant it's, we've seen this enormous move across the power generation sector, including here in Michigan. But as far as the policy, so, I think this brings together some of the things that Julia was talking about as well, that, I think the Biden administration has called the climate crisis something that requires an all-of-government approach. And I think that they apply that very broadly to the topic of climate change. And to all of the federal agencies, not just the EPA. But at least within EPA, right, we have colleagues who specifically work on setting emission requirements for the electric power generation sector. So certainly well aware that in order to meet the ambitious goals that this administration has already established for 2030 and for beyond, that we will have to have lower and lower carbon power generation. So, so that's my thoughts on that. As far as certainly from an analytical perspective, we look at the issues of upstream emissions to make sure that we understand what the impact of policies are under different scenarios. So that would be something that we always would pay attention to. But in my last post is going to be regarding Brian. Brett, when you asked me before the theoretical question about program structures that could could mandate certain levels, you know, from the technical perspective, we've always thought it's been very good to have performance-based standards for the very reason that Brian mentioned. You know, that you know, while in the long run, probably there is only a handful of technologies we know of today that are possible of zero emission technology. You know, this transition that we're going through, performance-based standards do provide opportunities for companies to choose their own path for how to get there. And certainly from at least the many decade history of our mobile source program, that has proven to be very valuable for the industry and a good policy to let the private sector figure out, you know, through their own successes and failures with the right technology package to meet a given target.
Very good. Julia and Brian, we're getting toward the end here. We have about 5 minutes left. I want to come back to this question about competitiveness internationally. When we look at China, has a very specific policy to shift to EVs, even if it is coal-fired, coal-charged EVs, they're doing it to get ahead. They're doing it to own the market. When we look at Europe, they, I think, have a target of zero emissions by 2035 that's going to drive the technology there. We have a very different policy here. In fact, one of the comments is, how do we get a more consistent policy from administration to administration? But what do you look for in the upcoming policy discussion and announcements that'll help increase the competitiveness of the US manufacturers and then Brian suppliers?
Well, I'm going to start by saying that the companies I represent are all competitive.
And they're all international.
And they're international and they're domestic. I mean, we're bringing a global perspective to and through the auto industry with our organization. And the fact of the matter is, regulations or no regulations, they're all going to be looking at how to compete. Now, if I'm thinking about the longer term time frame, our companies are making announcements about the direction they're going and about increasing electrification. And that is in response to the climate challenge, in response to various regulatory schemes. And really it's driving our activity right now in so many ways. And so when I then come even closer in time frame and think about these near-term standards, we know there's opportunity for more greenhouse gas reductions than what the current program requires. We know that we're trying to get to electrification. To be competitive, we need to make sure that the right balance is being struck between the level of the standards, the flexibility in the standards, and ultimately the way that companies will invest in meeting those standards. And so if we have $330 billion right now going into electrification through 2025, it's really important that we have a regulatory scheme that recognizes that investment and the direction that we're ultimately going.
Brian.
So very good question. I would, back to your point about, you know, China switching over to a lot of battery electric vehicles. You know, they have local pollution problems very similar to what California does in some of their, you know, cities and the clean air that they'd like to have in California. You know, in China's policy is to essentially generate the coal power somewhere else and have, you know, clean vehicles in the cities. But that doesn't mean they're zero emission vehicles. And I think, you know, back to the point before, we need to look holistically at this from a life cycle standpoint, both the upstream generation of power, the upstream expenditure of energy and CO2 generation while the vehicles are made as well. Back to the power plants, the most efficient, natural gas plant, cogen plant is about 45% thermally efficient. A coal plant's 30 or 45% efficient. A coal plant's like 35 to 40. So those are pretty low thermal efficiencies. And we've got internal combustion engines that are hybridized that now are above 50% thermal efficiency. So if you start even after you convert all the coal plants into natural gas, now there's not a lot of reduction you can do. You've kind of already had your big changeover. Then you need to start talking solar and wind and other generation sources. And I think we're going to see a lot of technologies on the ICE side that will compete very favorably with that as well. And that's why I think we should try to be as technology agnostic as we can in the future.
Thank you. So we have about a minute and a half left. We can go a little longer. Bill, closing thoughts, and we're not necessarily what to expect tomorrow or the next day or in the near future, but kind of the vision for EPA on where we go from here. And I know you're not speaking for all of EPA, and I know Gina would probably and others might, but just kind of your perspective from Ann Arbor.
Yeah, so I'll end with what I started. I think that this enormous transition that has been accelerating in the auto industry very recently towards zero-emission vehicles is an enormous opportunity for the country. It has enormous impacts on making sure that the consumers are with us, and as Chris said, that the consumers want the vehicles. So we have to, the industry has to provide them products that excite them, and that's, you got whole teams at all the companies if that's their goal. The policies from this administration and hopefully future administrations to help promote and support this massive transformation for the light-duty vehicle sector will be really important. And if those things happen, to some extent, EPA's mission of having policies and standards that require ultra-clean, low-emission vehicles, it will get easier and easier over time as this transition happens. So I think that we're really at a pretty unique time in history where we can see all these things line up and really make some very massive improvements in public health and welfare and addressing climate change.
Julia, from your point, from Autos Innovate, what didn't we talk about? What did we miss? What was important today?
Well, what's really important for today is making sure that we have a comprehensive national strategy for whatever direction we are going. And I'm very much making the assumption that electrification will be a big part of where we are going. And so it is just absolutely critical that we are working on the right structure or frame for the regulations that are coming out to have tools in the toolbox to encourage EVs, that we're looking at the opportunity to increase EVs beyond 2025 and 2026, and that ultimately we are putting in place all of the other pieces that are going to help lead our nation through this innovative and progressive time with electric vehicles.
Brian.
I would just say that I love driving electric vehicles. There's fantastic performance. The highest torque at 0 RPM is fantastic for off the line. I think the critical thing for our industry is to just make sure that we're looking realistically and holistically at this whole problem so that we don't get caught up in the term zero emission vehicle. We really look behind that to understand that there is no zero emission vehicle, and that we factor all of that in as we make these decisions, and that we look at the technology overall and how we can best reduce the CO2 footprint from the transportation industry most efficiently.
So Chris, we're going to go a totally different direction. Oh, go ahead. I'll come back to you. Go ahead.
Last word, that would be awesome. Beyond
2 last words.
Okay, beyond direct sales. Well, that would be, we should accelerate into this S curve and not just lean in. That's the best way we can protect our economy and our environment. So
close us out. What's the most interesting thing about working for a Tesla startup versus your background? What's cool? What's a Tesla Rivian? I'm sorry. I was going to ask you a question about Tesla, but you and I thought maybe that one's not for later. For working for Rivian, what's been kind of eye-opening for you?
Well, boy, there's so many things, but I think it really comes down to the vehicles. They're just incredible. I mean, you'll have a chance to get in one soon. The culture there is great too. If if anybody's looking, I think we have some spaces open still. We're still hiring, but it's two, the culture and really the vehicles. They're really incredible, and as we accelerate into this new vehicle segment, I think you're seeing other manufacturers also step into the truck segment and the SUV segment. So it's the vehicles and the culture.
So I want to go backwards. Chris, thank you so much for coming up. And I know I hope RJ thinks it's okay, and I think we checked most of the boxes. And Brian, it's always good for you to join, and Julia, it's always good. And most importantly, Bill, we know how much you know and how much you can't tell us, and we really appreciate your willingness to talk with us about this and to walk through it. And what we're going to do is tomorrow at 1 o'clock, we're going to come back and try this again, right? No? Yeah, maybe. Again, so...
Tomorrow evening, you could probably have an additional build on from today's discussion.
I think this was a really good discussion, considering a lot of things, but even with that, great discussion. Thank you to all of these folks for really coming up in a tough spot and doing a great job. And thank you all for sticking with us.